It was supposed to be a simple gathering, nothing out of the ordinary. A family barbecue in the backyard, where the smell of sizzling burgers and hot dogs mingled with the soft hum of laughter and casual conversation. The sun was setting, casting a golden hue over the garden, and the clinking of glasses and the clatter of utensils filled the air as friends and family gathered to enjoy the warmth of the evening. It was one of those rare moments when everything seemed perfect: the music, the food, the people. Nothing out of place, nothing to disrupt the flow of joy. But just when everything appeared to be aligned for the perfect evening, a single moment would change everything forever. Karen, a neighbor who lived a few houses down, had always been a quiet presence in the community. She wasn't particularly friendly, but she wasn't overtly hostile either. Her interactions were brief and often laced with passive-aggressive comments that no one took seriously. In the years that the family had lived in the neighborhood, they had barely interacted with her, except for the occasional forced exchange across fences or at community gatherings. Yet, there was always something unsettling about Karen, a quiet resentment that simmered beneath her polite smile. Her behavior had always seemed slightly off, but no one gave it much thought. She was just another neighbor, another face in the crowd. But that evening, Karen's simmering frustration would manifest in the most terrifying of ways. It wasn't as if she suddenly snapped. No, it was much darker and far more calculated than that. In her mind, the family had become an object of disdain, something to be destroyed. But why? The answer wasn't clear, not yet. All that was known was that, after everything that had been said and done, Karen's grievances had finally reached a boiling point. What followed was an act so incomprehensible that, in the days that followed, it was hard to understand how something so senseless could have happened. One moment, the family was enjoying the warmth of their meal, joking and laughing, completely oblivious to the dark turn that was about to unfold. Then, without warning, a shot rang out, a deafening sound that shattered the peace of the evening and the lives of everyone present. It wasn't just the violence that struck them like a blow. It was the absurdity of it all. Karen's justification, if it could even be called that, was equally perplexing. She claimed, in the most chillingly calm manner, that she mistook ketchup for blood. The words didn't make sense. How could someone confuse a simple condiment, something so mundane, with the blood of a loved one? It didn't matter that she was standing over the wife, who lay crumpled on the ground, her head bleeding from the gunshot wound. Karen's words were like a cruel punch to the gut, adding to the already unimaginable horror. "I thought it was blood," she said, as if that somehow explained the unexplainable. At that moment, time seemed to slow down. The world tilted on its axis. The family, who had been celebrating just minutes before, was now forced to confront a reality more grotesque than they could have ever imagined. The wife, who had been laughing and enjoying the evening, was now fighting for her life, blood pooling around her. The laughter that had filled the air just moments ago had turned to silence, the world frozen in shock. It wasn't just a shooting, it was a betrayal of the highest order. This wasn't some random act of violence committed by a stranger. No, this was Karen, someone who had been part of their lives, someone who had walked the same streets, passed by their house, and exchanged pleasantries on countless occasions. Yet, under the surface of everyday life, something darker had been festering. No one knew the extent of Karen's bitterness, her jealousy, her resentment. No one knew that she had been silently seething, harboring grudges and grievances that, over time, had built into a destructive force. And now, all of that had culminated in this single unthinkable act. The shock wasn't just in the violence, but in the sense of helplessness that followed. The family was left to pick up the shattered pieces of their lives. Their world, once filled with the joy of simple pleasures, was now a landscape of grief, confusion, and anger. How could this happen? How could a simple barbecue, a gathering of friends and family, turn into something so tragic? As the days passed, the family was forced to grapple with the aftermath of the shooting. The wife's condition was critical, and the physical toll on her body was devastating. But it wasn't just the physical injury that would leave scars. It was the emotional devastation that would linger long after the blood had dried. The question of why this happened would haunt them, an unanswerable riddle that seemed to mock them at every turn. They couldn't understand Karen's actions. How could someone who had shared their neighborhood, their community, and their lives suddenly snap in such a violent and irrational way? Was it truly as simple as a misunderstanding over ketchup? Or was there something deeper, something more sinister lurking beneath the surface? In the wake of the incident, the family began to unravel the truth. They started questioning everything about their interactions with Karen. They tried to make sense of the events leading up to the shooting, looking for any signs, any clues that could have hinted at the rage simmering inside her. But there were no answers, only more questions. Karen's strange defense that she thought the ketchup was blood only deepened the mystery. Was she insane? Or was there something more to her story than anyone had realized? What was clear, however, was that the family was now irrevocably changed. The sense of safety that had once surrounded their home was gone, replaced by fear and uncertainty. The love they once had for their neighbor, however distant, had been replaced by distrust. How could they ever look at her the same way again? How could they ever feel safe in their own community, knowing that the person living just a few houses down was capable of such violence? The days that followed would be filled with the painstaking process of coming to terms with what had happened. The family would have to rebuild not just their lives, but their sense of security and trust. But in the back of their minds, the question remained, why? Why had Karen done this? And more importantly, how could they ever move on from the senselessness of it all? This was not just a story of a senseless shooting. It was a story of betrayal, of a hidden darkness that can lie just beneath the surface of even the most ordinary lives. The aftermath would be a journey of discovery, a journey to understand how such a tragedy could unfold in the most unlikely of places. The family would have to confront their worst fears, their own vulnerability, and ultimately their desire for justice. But for now, all they had were the fragments of their shattered world and the painful question that would echo in their minds forever. How could Karen have done this? The neighborhood was the kind where everyone knew each other's names, and Saturday afternoons were spent exchanging pleasantries over the fences that separated the neatly manicured lawns. It was a suburban haven, where life seemed to follow a predictable rhythm. The families on the block had lived there for years, and most had raised their children in the same homes. It was a community built on shared history and an unspoken understanding of how things worked. The days stretched lazily, marked only by the occasional hum of lawnmowers or the distant sound of children playing in the park. And within this setting, there existed a certain comfort, a sense of safety that one could take for granted. For the protagonist and their spouse, it was a life they had chosen, a life they thought they could rely on. Their house was their sanctuary, a place where they could retreat from the world's chaos and enjoy the small pleasures of life. They spent their weekends doing ordinary things, gardening, cooking, hosting barbecues for friends and family. It was their routine, and it was comfortable. The house, with its red brick walls and white trim, had been their home for nearly a decade, filled with memories and quiet moments of joy. Their backyard, a spacious area adorned with potted plants and a grill, was the perfect setting for a laid-back barbecue. That Saturday afternoon, like so many others before it, seemed destined to be another simple gathering. The guests arrived slowly, trickling in with smiles and small gifts of wine or desserts. The air was warm, the kind of warmth that makes you want to stay outside forever. The sun was beginning its descent, casting a golden glow over everything. The music was soft in the background, laughter bubbled up from the group, and the scent of burgers and hot dogs on the grill filled the air. Everything felt right. Karen had been a neighbor for a few years now, and like most neighbors, she'd been part of the occasional community event. But she was never the center of attention. Her presence was often understated, and for the most part, she kept to herself. It wasn't that she was disliked, she was just distant. She had never been someone who joined in on the conversations or shared in the collective camaraderie of the neighborhood. But she was never rude. If you saw her in the yard, she'd wave a polite hello, even if her eyes never quite matched the warmth of her gesture. There was something about her that made people uncomfortable, though no one could quite put their finger on it. The protagonist and their spouse had always given her the benefit of the doubt. Perhaps she had just never been the social type they thought. Her slightly aloof demeanor didn't warrant any deeper analysis. After all, everyone has their quirks, and as long as she wasn't causing trouble, she was just another face in the crowd. But on that day, that fateful Saturday, Karen's presence would be felt in a way no one could have anticipated. She arrived a little late, as she often did, carrying a small salad she'd clearly thrown together at the last minute. Her outfit was plain as always, and her hair was pulled back into a no-nonsense bun. She was greeted warmly, but her response was distant, almost curt. No one thought anything of it, assuming she was just her usual self. As the evening wore on, she stood apart from the others, leaning against the wooden fence, sipping her drink and observing, but not participating. Her eyes darted around the yard, her gaze lingering on the family with an odd intensity that no one seemed to notice. There was a tension in her demeanor, something that was there but not acknowledged. It was as though she were holding something back, a secret brewing beneath the surface of her stiff exterior. The barbecue continued without a hitch. The conversation flowed, the drinks were passed around, and the jokes grew louder. The children ran around the yard, playing tag and laughing as their parents kept an eye on them from the sidelines. Everything was as it should be. There was no sign of the storm that was about to break. At one point, Karen's eyes locked onto the protagonist's wife, who was tending to the grill, flipping burgers with a laugh. It was a small moment, nothing out of the ordinary, but Karen's stare lingered a little too long. The wife caught her eye and offered a friendly smile, the kind of smile one gives to a neighbor they see regularly but never truly know. Karen's lips twitched slightly, but she didn't return the smile. Instead, she took a sip from her glass, her eyes never leaving the wife's figure. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but there was something in the way she looked at her, something cold. For the rest of the evening, Karen stood there, a silent observer, as the family and their friends continued their casual celebration. No one paid her much mind, but in the back of their minds, they may have sensed that something was slightly off, a prickling feeling of discomfort like the calm before a storm. But no one could have predicted the violence that was coming. No one could have known that behind her quiet gaze, behind her seemingly indifferent exterior, Karen was seething with resentment. The perfect facade of suburban life was about to crack wide open, revealing a darkness no one had seen coming. The family continued to enjoy their evening, unaware that the danger was already upon them. In the distance, Karen's tense posture began to shift. She took one last glance at the gathering, her gaze settling once more on the protagonist's wife. For a moment, there was a flicker of something darker in her eyes, something that had been simmering for far too long. It was as if she had made up her mind. The decision had been made, and as the sun dipped lower, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, Karen took the first steps toward turning the evening into a nightmare. No one knew it yet, but that evening would be the last time anyone saw the family's home as a peaceful, safe place. The tranquility of the moment, the warmth of the barbecue, and the camaraderie of the gathering would all soon be overshadowed by the violence of what was about to unfold. The question that lingered, but no one could yet answer, was simple. Why? Why had Karen crossed the line from neighbor to killer? And more disturbingly, what had pushed her to commit such an unthinkable act? The answers were closer than anyone realized, buried deep within the unspoken grievances that had festered between Karen and the family. But for now, the calm before the storm was all anyone could remember. It wasn't just the violence that left a lasting scar, it was the sheer unpredictability of it all. What began as a pleasant afternoon, filled with the sounds of children playing and friends chatting, ended in chaos and terror. The mood had shifted subtly throughout the day, a feeling of unease hanging in the air, but no one had known that the tension was about to snap. The unexpected arrival of Karen had set things in motion, but no one could have foreseen how quickly everything would unravel. The turning point came when Karen, after hours of lingering on the periphery of the gathering, suddenly moved closer to the grill. Her eyes now fixed not on the family, but on the wife, who had been tending to the food. The wife, blissfully unaware of the change in Karen's demeanor, was focused on flipping the burgers and ensuring everything was cooked perfectly. It was a simple moment, one that should have been nothing more than an ordinary part of the evening. But Karen's gaze was no longer the indifferent one of a distant neighbor. It was intense and calculating, as if she were studying her every move. At first, the wife thought nothing of it. There was always the odd comment from Karen about the food or the way things were done. But this was different. Karen's body language had shifted, too. Her posture was rigid, and there was something almost predatory in the way she stood, as if she were watching the prey before making her move. But no one said anything. No one noticed how Karen had slowly inched closer to the grill, how her gaze had narrowed in on the wife. The laughter from the others continued to fill the air, masking the tension that had begun to build. The shooting happened in a flash, so quickly that no one could have reacted in time. Karen, standing a few feet away from the wife, suddenly pulled out a gun, an ordinary weapon that no one had seen coming. She raised it and fired, and everything that had been calm, peaceful, and familiar shattered in an instant. The wife collapsed to the ground, her body crumpling beneath her. The life drained out of her by a single brutal shot. The family and friends around her froze, stunned into complete paralysis. The air became thick with confusion and disbelief. The sound of the gunshot echoed in their ears, too loud to ignore, too jarring to comprehend. There was no time to process what had happened, no time to make sense of the madness that had just unfolded before them. Karen stood there, still holding the gun, her face an unreadable mask. There was no remorse in her expression, no sign of panic, no trace of the typical reactions one might expect from someone who had just committed such a heinous act. Instead, she simply looked down at the wife's body, lying motionless on the ground. Then, in the most bizarre, detached manner, she said something that none of them would ever forget. "I thought it was blood." The words didn't make sense. Blood? What was she talking about? How could she mistake the wife, a person she had known for years, for something as ordinary as ketchup? The statement was nonsensical, like a puzzle with no solution. No one could grasp how she had gone from a distant neighbor to a murderer with such absurd justification. But those words, those chilling words, were all that came next, as if they could somehow make sense of the violence that had just transpired. But nothing about it made sense. The family and their friends, still in shock, started to move. Some rushed to the wife's side, others backed away in fear, unsure of what to do next. The children, who had been playing just moments before, began to scream, their tiny voices cutting through the chaos. Someone screamed for help, but in those first few seconds, everything felt like a blur. The concept of reality itself seemed to shatter. The wife's breathing was shallow, blood pooling around her as the family gathered around her, trying desperately to stop the flow. But the more they tried, the more it seemed hopeless. Karen's casual dismissal of the event, her calmness, only made it worse. She didn't apologize, didn't look distressed. There was only that strange, emotionless statement. "I thought it was blood." It was as if she were speaking in another language, disconnected from the scene, unable or unwilling to grasp the magnitude of her actions. It was then that the police arrived, but by then, the damage had been done. The wife, though still alive, was gravely injured, and Karen was quickly apprehended. The surreal quality of the moment lingered, as if everyone had been thrust into a nightmare with no escape. The authorities took Karen into custody, but her bizarre defense that she had confused ketchup with blood was met with bewilderment and disbelief. The shooting was senseless. The justification made no sense. But no one knew how to piece it all together. The aftermath was a slow-moving blur of confusion and grief. The family, reeling from the shock of what had just transpired, had to navigate not only the trauma of the shooting but the incomprehensible nature of Karen's actions. How had this neighbor, this seemingly ordinary woman, been capable of such brutality? What had triggered her to do something so unthinkable? The hospital was a place of sterile coldness, a sharp contrast to the warmth of the barbecue that had just moments before filled the air. The wife was rushed into surgery, and the protagonist stood by, waiting for any shred of news, any sign that she would survive. It wasn't just her physical wounds that needed mending, it was the emotional devastation that would take far longer to heal. They were now left to navigate a world that had been irrevocably changed, a world where safety was a fragile illusion, shattered by the actions of someone they had once regarded as harmless. But for now, all they had were questions, questions that would never be answered easily. What had driven Karen to do this? Was she truly mad, or was there something more insidious at play? Her defense, the ludicrous claim that she had mistaken ketchup for blood, hung in the air, an absurdity that felt like a slap in the face. In those first moments after the shooting, everything was impossible to grasp. All the family could do was hold on to each other, trying to make sense of a world that no longer made sense. The community they had known, the one that had always seemed so safe, now felt like a foreign place. Trust, once so easily given, had been shattered, and the fear of the unknown crept into every corner of their minds. The protagonist didn't know how to move forward. All they could think about was the wife, her life hanging in the balance, her body wounded, her future uncertain. And then there was Karen, whose actions had turned their world upside down. The questions lingered. Why? How could this happen? What had driven Karen to commit such a senseless act? But the answers, for now, remained elusive. The only thing that was certain was the devastation left in the wake of Karen's madness. The rest of the world might have moved on, but for the family, everything had changed. And as they sat in that sterile hospital room, all they could do was wait for answers, wait for healing, and wait for the chance to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. The days that followed the shooting were nothing short of a nightmare. The world, once familiar and safe, was now a place of uncertainty, grief, and constant questioning. The wife, who had been the light of the family, the one who always held them together with her warmth and infectious laughter, was now clinging to life in a hospital bed. The injury to her head had been severe, and the doctors worked tirelessly, their hands covered in her blood as they tried to repair the damage. But no one knew if she would survive. The waiting was unbearable. As the protagonist sat by their wife's side, a wave of guilt washed over them. There were moments when they questioned whether they could have done something to prevent this, some sign they had missed, some action they should have taken. The idea that Karen, someone who had been living in the same neighborhood for years, could snap in such a violent way was unfathomable. The family had always thought of Karen as just a distant, perhaps mildly irritating neighbor. They had no idea that she was harboring such deep-seated anger. And now, the consequences of that hidden resentment were felt in every breath, every silent moment in the hospital room. The protagonist's mind raced as they reflected on the years of knowing Karen. There had never been a sign that she was capable of such madness. She had always been polite, albeit distant. There had been the occasional awkward encounter, but nothing that could have predicted this. It was a betrayal on a level they had never anticipated. How could someone they had known for so long be capable of taking such a violent action? It was hard to reconcile the image of the woman who had waved from her porch with the woman who had pulled the trigger in cold blood. As the protagonist stayed by their wife's side, they felt a crushing sense of helplessness. There was nothing they could do to reverse what had happened. They couldn't undo the horror of that moment, and they couldn't erase the fact that Karen had forever altered their family's life. The family was no longer the same. The bond they had shared, once so strong, now seemed fragile in the face of this traumatic event. The protagonist tried to stay strong, to keep a sense of normalcy, but it was impossible. Every corner of their world was now tainted by what had occurred. The emotional toll on the children was equally devastating. The youngest, who had been playing just a few yards away from the grill, couldn't understand what had happened. They had seen their mother fall, heard the screams, and felt the terror that swept through the gathering. They didn't know what a gunshot meant, but they knew something was terribly wrong. For them, the world would never be the same. The innocence of childhood had been stripped away in an instant. The older child was more aware, but their own grief and confusion ran just as deep. They were scared, terrified, not just for their mother, but for their own safety. How could they ever feel safe again, knowing that something so senseless could happen in their own backyard? The community, once a source of comfort, had become an uncertain place. The protagonist had always believed that they were surrounded by a network of people who would offer support in times of need. But now, the lines between neighbors and strangers blurred. Some came forward, offering condolences, but their words rang hollow. Others kept their distance, unsure of how to approach the tragedy. Everyone had questions, but no one had answers. Why had Karen done it? Was she truly mentally unstable, or was there something darker behind her actions? The more they thought about it, the more they realized that Karen had been living a double life, hiding her resentment behind the veneer of normalcy. The realization that someone they had considered a neighbor, a part of their community, could harbor such violent intentions was a blow that shattered their sense of security. For the protagonist, it was a constant battle between holding on to the hope that their wife would survive and the overwhelming fear that they might lose her. Every moment spent in the sterile hospital room was filled with a mixture of grief, fear, and confusion. They couldn't leave her side, but they also couldn't stop the barrage of questions that kept racing through their mind. What would happen next? How would they ever rebuild their lives after this? What would the future look like for their family? As the wife's condition remained critical, the emotional weight on the protagonist grew heavier. It wasn't just the physical wounds that needed healing, it was the emotional devastation that had been inflicted on the family, the trust that had been broken, the fear that now lingered in every corner of their home, and the overwhelming sense of helplessness were things that no amount of time or medical care could fix. They were irrevocably changed, and the long road to recovery, both physical and emotional, seemed daunting. The community tried to offer support, but nothing could fill the void that had been left by the shooting. The family no longer felt like part of the neighborhood. Their lives had been so violently interrupted that they couldn't see the world the same way anymore. The small, safe bubble they had lived in had burst, leaving behind only the raw, painful reality of what had happened. No one knew what to say. No one knew how to make it better. The protagonist was left to grapple with the aftermath, trying to find a way to move forward while holding onto the hope that, somehow, things would get better. But the emotional fallout wasn't just about the immediate impact, it was about the long-term effects that would ripple through their lives. The psychological scars of the shooting would take years to heal, if they ever did at all. The protagonist could already feel the weight of their new reality. How could they ever feel safe again? How could they trust the people around them, knowing that someone so close, someone who had been a part of their daily lives, could turn so violently against them? In the days and weeks that followed, the family would begin the slow process of healing. But for now, the pain was still fresh. Every moment was a reminder of the horror they had witnessed, and the uncertainty of what the future held loomed over them. They were stuck in a place between grief and fear, unable to see the way forward, unsure of how to move past the trauma that had taken root in their hearts. The wife, still fighting for her life, remained the center of everything. The protagonist's world had shrunk to the sterile, white walls of the hospital room, where every beep of the machine, every change in the wife's condition, felt like a reminder that the nightmare was not over. And even as they clung to the hope that their loved one would recover, the emotional toll of the incident weighed heavily on their soul, knowing that nothing could ever be the same again. As the family faced the reality of their new, fractured existence, they could only begin to imagine the road ahead. But one thing was certain. They would never forget the day Karen shattered their world, leaving behind a trail of devastation that no one could have predicted. In the days after the shooting, as the family began to process the horror that had shattered their lives, one thought consumed the protagonist: justice. There was no escaping the images of the moment. The gunshot, the blood, Karen standing over their wife's body with that cold, detached expression. The absurdity of her defense, claiming she mistook ketchup for blood, was not only offensive but also insulting. How could anyone believe such a ludicrous explanation? How could the system allow someone like Karen to walk free with such an absurd justification? The questions were endless, and the frustration that had built up inside the protagonist began to take form. They could not simply sit by and let Karen's actions go unpunished. There had to be accountability. There had to be a reckoning. But as the family soon realized, seeking justice would be far from straightforward. In fact, the more they delved into the investigation, the more they realized how complex and often frustrating the process would be. First, there was the legal system. The police had arrested Karen immediately, but they had to build a case. They had to prove that Karen's actions were premeditated, that she had intended to kill, not just acted out of some mistaken panic. The defense she presented, that she had confused ketchup with blood, made the entire case more complicated. Could anyone take her seriously? Or was it just an attempt to claim insanity, a desperate ploy to avoid responsibility for her actions? The protagonist was determined to see this through, but the road ahead was filled with obstacles. The legal system moved at a glacial pace, and each day, without answers, felt like an eternity. As the family sat through endless meetings with lawyers, they began to understand the intricacies of the case. There were questions about Karen's mental state. Was she truly insane? Did she have a history of violent behavior or mental illness that might explain her actions? The police and the prosecution seemed focused on this angle, trying to determine whether Karen had been in her right mind when she shot the wife. But for the family, this was irrelevant. It didn't matter whether Karen was mentally unstable. What mattered was that she had taken a life. What mattered was that the wife was fighting for her life, and Karen had been the cause of it all. The frustration was palpable. The protagonist couldn't understand why it was taking so long to bring Karen to justice. Every delay felt like a betrayal, and every moment spent waiting for the legal process to unfold felt like an eternity. But there was no escaping the reality of the situation. The wheels of justice turned slowly, and the family had to remain patient, something that felt nearly impossible. Amidst the frustration, the protagonist found themselves obsessing over the details of the incident. They began to replay the day over and over in their mind, trying to find some clue, some piece of evidence that would explain Karen's motives. They dug into Karen's background, hoping to find something, anything that would shed light on her actions. What had driven her to do something so senseless? The investigation revealed nothing extraordinary about Karen's life. She had lived alone in her small house, kept to herself, and had few close relationships. There were no signs of a violent past, no indication that she had been capable of such brutality. But as the protagonist dug deeper, they began to uncover troubling details about Karen's interactions with the family. It was clear that Karen had been harboring resentment for a long time. Small comments, petty grievances, passive-aggressive remarks, all of them now seemed to add up to something much darker. Perhaps this shooting had not been an isolated incident of madness. Perhaps it had been a culmination of years of bitterness and jealousy. Karen had never directly confronted the family, but it was evident now that she had been simmering with resentment for a long time. This discovery made the protagonist even more determined to find justice. They couldn't let Karen get away with what she had done. It wasn't just about the physical wounds their wife had suffered. It was about the violation of trust, the betrayal of their sense of safety, and the way Karen had destroyed their peaceful life. The more they learned, the more they realized how far-reaching Karen's actions had been. It wasn't just one act of violence, it was a destruction of everything they had worked for, everything they had held dear. But as the legal battle wore on, the emotional toll began to mount. The protagonist had to balance their fight for justice with the constant worry over their wife's health. Her recovery was slow, and every day in the hospital felt like a lifetime. The doctors had done all they could, but the prognosis remained uncertain. There were good days, and then there were bad days. Sometimes, it felt like their wife was slipping further away from them. It was a constant battle of hope and despair. The protagonist's determination to see Karen held accountable became their sole focus. They couldn't afford to let up, not when their wife's life was at stake. They began to take matters into their own hands, contacting witnesses from the barbecue, gathering evidence, and talking to anyone who might have insight into Karen's mental state. It was clear that Karen's version of events, her defense of mistaken identity, wasn't going to be enough. There had to be more to the story, and the protagonist was determined to uncover it, no matter what it took. But even as they threw themselves into the pursuit of justice, the emotional toll continued to grow. The guilt, the anger, the constant fear for their wife's recovery, it was a weight that pressed down on them every single day. They couldn't escape the images of Karen standing over their wife's body, those cold, detached words hanging in the air. "I thought it was blood." Those words, absurd as they were, kept echoing in their mind, refusing to be silenced. And then there were the moments of doubt. What if Karen was truly insane? What if she had no control over her actions? The family struggled with this thought, torn between the desire for justice and the fear that the legal system might fail them. What if Karen's defense was successful? What if she walked free, her actions dismissed as the result of some mental disorder? The idea was almost too much to bear. But despite the uncertainty, the protagonist knew that they had to continue fighting. They had no choice. Their wife's life, their family's future, depended on it. Justice was not just a concept, it was the only thing that could restore some semblance of order to their shattered world. As they prepared for the long, arduous road ahead, they knew one thing for sure. They would never stop seeking justice for what Karen had done. They would fight for their wife, for their family, and for the future that had been so cruelly ripped away from them. They would not let Karen's actions go unpunished. Not now. Not ever. After weeks of mounting tension, sleepless nights, and relentless pursuit, the truth about Karen's actions slowly began to surface, unraveling a narrative far darker than anyone had anticipated. The protagonist had refused to let the case go, their quest for justice unwavering. They had poured through every detail, from the witness testimonies to the investigation, into Karen's background. As the investigation deepened, it became apparent that the reality of Karen's motives was far more complex than a simple case of mental instability or a fleeting act of violence. There was a story behind the senselessness, a twisted tale of unspoken resentment, jealousy, and a psychological unraveling that had been quietly building for years. The courtroom became the battleground where the truth would finally come to light. The prosecution presented a compelling case, showing that Karen's actions weren't a product of a random, misguided burst of violence, but rather the culmination of years of simmering anger and resentment that she had carefully concealed behind a mask of normalcy. Witnesses from the neighborhood came forward, recounting the subtle signs of Karen's hostility toward the family. Her passive-aggressive comments about the wife's success, her quiet but persistent judgments about the family's social gatherings, her jealousy over their seemingly perfect life. These all painted a disturbing picture of a woman whose calm exterior had masked a festering rage. The defense, led by Karen's lawyer, still clung to the narrative that she had been suffering from a temporary mental breakdown and that the shooting was a tragic mistake. Karen herself, still distant and emotionless, sat in the courtroom, occasionally glancing at the family, but never fully acknowledging the pain she had caused. Her claim that she had mistaken ketchup for blood was repeated, though by now it seemed increasingly absurd and out of place in the face of mounting evidence. But the truth was far more chilling. As the pieces fell into place, it became clear that Karen had been stalking the family for months, perhaps even longer. Her resentment had built quietly, with no one suspecting how deeply she had been affected by the family's success and the warmth that radiated from their home. She had observed them, silently judging, and as her jealousy festered, it became more than just casual disdain. It became an obsession. The wife, a woman who had always been kind to her, had unwittingly become the target of Karen's hatred. What had started as small slights had grown into a dangerous fixation. The breakthrough came when investigators discovered a hidden journal in Karen's home. The journal, though disturbingly erratic, revealed the extent of her obsession with the family. She had meticulously recorded every interaction with the wife, documenting her feelings of inadequacy, jealousy, and anger. It was clear that Karen had been harboring a deep-seated grudge, one that had grown more irrational and dangerous as time passed. The journal entries, coupled with testimonies from neighbors who had witnessed her increasingly erratic behavior, painted a portrait of a woman on the brink of breakdown. But what made her pull the trigger that day remained unclear. Was it an irrational outburst fueled by envy? Or had it been a carefully planned act, one that had been years in the making? As the case continued, the protagonists struggled with their own emotions. They had hoped for clarity, for justice, but as the truth emerged, it became harder to reconcile the Karen they had known with the monster who had tried to destroy their family. The anger they felt was overwhelming, but so was the sense of sorrow. Karen had been a part of their community for years. She had shared the same spaces, smiled in passing, and yet no one had seen the storm brewing inside her. No one had understood the depths of her resentment, nor had anyone been able to stop her from crossing the line. In the end, the trial concluded with a verdict that brought a small measure of justice. Karen was found guilty of attempted murder and was sentenced to a lengthy prison term. Her defense of temporary insanity was rejected, as the court found sufficient evidence to conclude that she had been aware of her actions. The decision, though a relief, did little to heal the emotional wounds that had been inflicted on the family. The protagonist knew that no verdict, no punishment could undo the trauma Karen had caused. But despite the conviction, there was still a long road ahead. The wife, though stable, faced a difficult recovery. Her physical wounds would heal, but the emotional scars would take far longer to fade. The family's sense of security, once taken for granted, had been shattered, and rebuilding trust, both within their own hearts and with those around them, was an ongoing struggle. The protagonist found themselves questioning everything they had once believed about their community, their safety, and the people they had called neighbors. Could anyone truly be trusted? How well did they really know the people around them? As the weeks turned into months, the family slowly began to heal. The protagonist and their wife spent long nights talking, processing the events that had unfolded, trying to make sense of it all. They had lost so much in those few moments when Karen's gunshot shattered their lives, but they had also gained something, an understanding of just how fragile life could be, how quickly everything could change. It was a lesson they would carry with them forever. The family began to rebuild their life, step by step. There were still moments of fear, moments when the memories of that fateful day crept back into their minds, but they learned to move forward. Slowly, they found their way back to each other, rebuilding not just their home but their sense of safety. They leaned on each other, drawing strength from their shared experience. In time, the laughter returned to their home, though it was tempered by the memory of what they had endured. As for Karen, her life had been irrevocably altered as well. She had gone from being a part of the community to becoming a symbol of betrayal, madness, and violence. The judgment of the court was just one part of her fate. The real consequences were far greater. The isolation, the shame, the knowledge that she would never be the same. She would spend years behind bars. But even then, she would never escape the reality of what she had done. In the end, the resolution was bittersweet. Justice had been served, but the wounds remained. The protagonist and their wife had found a way to move forward, but they would always carry the weight of what had happened. Their world had been shattered, but through their strength, they had begun to rebuild. And though they knew that the scars of the past would never fully fade, they also knew that the love and resilience they shared could carry them through anything that came next. If this story moved you, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an intense episode like this one. Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear what you think. Stay tuned for more gripping, real-life stories that will leave you speechless. Thank you for watching the HOA stories. Stay safe, and remember, sometimes the most dangerous people are those living right next door.